In this chilling true crime tale, a house with a dark, horrifying secret claims anyone who dares to step inside. Can one escape the suffocating darkness, or are they destined to become part of the nightmare forever? Stay tuned, because this story will haunt you long after it's over. This hook should capture the eerie essence of the story and spark curiosity, keeping your viewers engaged throughout the video. The old house sat silent under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Windows dark, doors locked. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. But something felt off. The floor creaked as footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A chill ran down the spine of the young woman standing in the entryway. Her breath came in short bursts. She had been drawn to this place by rumors. Dark stories from the town. Tales of an unsolved murder. A family ripped apart in a single night. They said the house was cursed. She didn't believe it. But now, standing here, doubts began to creep in. She stepped closer to the staircase. Her hand rested on the railing, cold to the touch. The steps beneath her feet groaned under the weight of her body. There was no turning back now. Each step up seemed heavier than the last. The air grew thicker, suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest. Upstairs, the silence was suffocating. It felt as if the walls were closing in around her. She didn't want to look, but her eyes were drawn to the door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. A faint, soft glow spilled out into the dark hallway. She didn't know why, but her feet moved toward it. Each step felt like a battle against her own instincts. Her hand reached for the doorknob. Cold. Shaking. Her fingers barely brushed against it when the door creaked open. The room inside was dimly lit. There on the floor lay something that made her freeze in place. A figure. Pale, lifeless. A pool of blood surrounding them. Her stomach lurched. It was as if the past had come alive in this moment. The body was recent. It couldn't be. She stepped back, heart racing. But then, the door slammed shut behind her. She turned, frantic. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed again. Coming closer. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was in here with her. And it was getting closer. The room felt smaller, hotter, claustrophobic. A whisper slid through the air. It wasn't words, just a sound, a presence. She was not alone. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She took a step back, her feet unsteady on the hardwood floor. Her pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out everything else. The whisper grew louder. Closer. A cold hand brushed her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around. But there was nothing. Just the heavy silence. Her mind raced. She needed to get out. The door. She reached for it, hands trembling. But it wouldn't budge. Her nails scraped against the wood in a frantic attempt to open it. Nothing. Then, from the corner of the room, a soft sound. The faintest of footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat. Slow. Deliberate. She turned toward the sound. A figure appeared in the shadows. Tall. Looming. A figure she couldn't quite make out. The faint glow of the room revealed nothing but darkness behind it. It was a man. Or something that looked like one. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his eyes on her. Cold. Empty. She felt her throat tighten. Her body frozen. The air grew impossibly still. Then, the whisper again. A low voice, barely audible. I see you. Her body jerked as she snapped to the side. She thought she saw movement in the dark. Something shifting, creeping closer. The figure. Was it smiling? A distorted grin. Sickening. Her breath quickened. The walls seemed to close in tighter. And then, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open from behind her. She didn't dare look back. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But she couldn't. She was trapped. The figure reached out. Slowly. His cold, skeletal fingers brushing her arm. She flinched, but she couldn't move. He pulled her towards him. Closer. The whisper again, clearer this time. I was waiting for you. The air turned icy. The world seemed to vanish. Her body went numb as he pulled her closer, the coldness of his touch seeping through her skin. Her mind screamed for her to escape, but her body refused to obey. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure's face was now visible, barely illuminated by the dim light. His eyes were hollow, black voids, endless and cold. His skin was pale, sickly, stretched too tight over his bones. A low, raspy breath escaped him. I've been waiting, he whispered again, his voice gravelly, unnatural. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Impossible. Her body felt as if it was being drawn into a vacuum, pulled into something dark and suffocating. The air became thick, heavy. It was as though she was suffocating on fear itself. His grin widened. But it wasn't human. It was wrong. Her heart hammered, her chest tight as she struggled to breathe. The room seemed to spin. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. She reached for the door again, her hand trembling. But it was as if it was moving further away from her, no matter how much she reached. The figure leaned closer, his cold breath brushing against her ear. I was once like you, he murmured, curious, seeking answers. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to give out. Her head spun as she fought to stay conscious. What do you want from me? She managed to whisper, though the words felt thick and foreign in her mouth. His lips parted slightly, his smile widening, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. I want you to stay. The whisper was almost a growl now. A pulse of energy shot through her body, pushing her back. But instead of retreating, her legs buckled. She collapsed to the ground, her body weak, as though the very life was being drained from her. The shadows around her shifted again. The room closed in further, the air growing colder. The figure's voice echoed in her mind now louder. You can never leave. You'll be part of this place forever. And then, just as quickly as the sensation began, the world around her went silent. The figure was gone, but the suffocating cold remained. She was alone again. But the whispers? They didn't stop. They circled her, haunting her every step. I'm still here, they said. And the darkness grew deeper. The cold was unbearable now, sinking into her bones. Her heart raced, but each beat felt sluggish, heavy. She struggled to rise, her legs trembling beneath her. Every movement was a battle, as though something invisible was weighing her down. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the air too thick, too dense to inhale properly. The whispering didn't stop. It was like an endless echo in her mind, repeating the same words. I'm still here. Her pulse quickened. Her hands shook as she tried to push herself to her feet, her fingers scraping against the floor for leverage. But the walls felt closer. Closer than they ever should. She could feel them pressing in on her, like a suffocating force. The door. It was still there, just out of reach. But it felt farther away than before. She stumbled toward it, each step more desperate than the last. The shadows swirled around her, tightening as though the room itself was alive. Her mind began to slip, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. I'm still here. Leave me alone, she cried out, her voice cracking with fear. But the words were lost in the suffocating silence that followed. The floor beneath her creaked again. A low, unsettling sound. Her hand grasped the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The air around her grew thick, pressing against her chest. It was as if something was holding her there, refusing to let her go. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A flicker, a movement, something in the shadows. A shape just out of focus. She turned her head, heart pounding, but it vanished before she could make sense of it. Was it him? The figure? Or something else entirely? The shadows shifted again, this time more violently. And then she felt it, a cold breath on her neck. She froze, her blood running cold. But when she turned to face it, there was nothing, just the stillness. But her eyes, wide and desperate, scanned the room. And then she saw it. A figure, not the same one as before. This one was standing in the doorway.
Tall, dark.
Impossible to ignore. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't real.
It couldn't be.
But the figure stepped forward. Closer. She wanted to scream, but the air was too thick to form words. And then it spoke. But this time, its voice was different. It wasn't whispering. It was clear.
Loud.
I've been waiting for you. The words echoed through her mind, louder than before. The voice was chilling, as if it came from deep within the earth itself. Her body tensed. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, like a shadow etched into the very air. Her breath was ragged, her chest tight with fear. She tried to move, but her legs were paralyzed, frozen to the floor. The figure stepped forward, his face still hidden in darkness. But she could feel his presence, like an invisible force pressing down on her. The shadows seemed to twist around him, bending with his every movement. And then, slowly, his face came into view. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The skin was stretched tight, pale, and cracked, like it had been burned and left to wither. His eyes were hollow, black pits of nothingness, like he had no soul left to give. But it wasn't just his appearance that terrified her. It was the sense of familiarity. She had seen him before. In her nightmares. In the stories she had heard about this house. He had been waiting. For her. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Her voice had been stolen by the terror that gripped her. The figure took another step forward, and with it, a wave of cold, suffocating air. The temperature dropped rapidly, and she felt her skin prickle, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Why are you doing this? She finally managed to whisper, her voice weak and trembling. The figure's lips curled into a grotesque smile. I don't do anything, he said, his voice low and guttural. I just wait. She staggered backward, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were shrinking around her. Please let me go, she begged, her voice breaking. But he only shook his head slowly. You've already come too far, he said softly, almost sympathetically. You're already part of this place. His words sliced through the air, leaving a hollow echo in her mind. The door behind her was still locked. She felt trapped. A distant, shrill scream echoed in her ears, but it wasn't hers. It was the sound of someone who had been here before her. Someone who had fallen into this same nightmare. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, eyes wide in terror. The figure loomed over her now, towering above, his face inches from hers. She could feel the coldness radiating from him, seeping into her skin. And then, he whispered, his voice like a death rattle. It's already too late. Her heart hammered in her chest, louder than ever before. Each beat felt like it was trying to escape her body. Her vision blurred, her limbs shaking uncontrollably. She could barely breathe. His presence suffocated her. The cold grew unbearable, gnawing at her, consuming every ounce of warmth she had left. I don't want to stay, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, his grin grew wider, stretching unnaturally across his face. It was as if he could taste her fear. The silence between them stretched, thick and oppressive. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out. His fingers, cold and skeletal, brushed against her cheek. She recoiled instinctively, but it was too late. His touch was like ice, freezing her to the core. Her breath caught, but no sound came out. And then he spoke again, his voice smooth, almost soothing. You don't get to leave, he said, his tone calm, as if explaining a simple truth. This place is yours now. Forever. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning in chaotic disarray.
No.
This couldn't be real. It was impossible. But every second, every moment she spent in his presence made it harder to deny. She looked around, eyes wide, searching for anything that could offer an escape. But there was nothing. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, alive with malevolent energy. The air grew heavier, thick with despair. Her breath came faster, more erratic. She couldn't stay here. She wouldn't. Panic surged through her, sharp and violent. In a blind rush of instinct, she pushed herself up from the floor. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move, stumbling toward the window. She had to get out. The window was cracked open, just enough to give her a chance. But the moment her fingers touched the glass, it shattered. The noise was deafening, sharp like a gunshot. She recoiled, her hands bleeding from the shards of glass. But it didn't matter. She had to get out. She turned back, one last time, to look at him. But he was gone. The shadows were empty. The air felt lighter, almost normal. She blinked, unsure of what she had just seen. Had it all been a hallucination? Her pulse slowed, the panic starting to subside. Maybe she had just imagined it all. But then, a sound. A whisper.
Soft.
Barely audible. "I'm still here." It came from behind her, and she knew deep down it was never really over. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The whisper was unmistakable.
Cold.
Unyielding. It came from behind her, just inches away. Her breath caught, freezing in her chest. Slowly, she turned around, every muscle tense, every nerve screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move. The figure was standing there again. Not in the shadows this time, but right in front of her. His face twisted in that grotesque, hollow grin. "You thought you could escape?" His voice was like gravel, scraping at her soul. Her mind screamed for her to run, to flee, but her legs refused to obey. It was as though the very air had become thick, solid, trapping her. The figure stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "I told you," he whispered, his voice sending a chill down her spine. "You belong here now. Forever." Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, as she tried to take a step back. But she couldn't. Her body was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far stronger than fear. The room began to warp around her. The walls stretched and bent, twisting in unnatural angles. The floor beneath her cracked, splintering like dry wood under the pressure of a storm. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was her. Her very reality seemed to be dissolving. "I'm not the first, you know," the figure continued, his voice cold, almost detached. "There have been others before you. Many others." Her eyes darted around the room, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. Faces. Ghostly faces. Emerging from the shadows, from the walls, from the very air itself. They were watching her. Some were familiar, others unfamiliar. But all of them had the same hollow, lifeless eyes. They were trapped here too, just like her. Her hands shook, her body trembling with fear. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't belong here." The figure's grin widened. "You already do," he said softly. "You just don't know it yet." She felt a cold hand wrap around her wrist. Not the figure's, but someone else's. A pale, bony hand, thin and frail. Her eyes flicked to the side, and she saw the other figure, a woman, her face gaunt and drawn, her eyes vacant and empty. The woman's lips parted in a hollow smile. "You're one of us now," she said, her voice soft, almost welcoming. The cold hand tightened its grip. Her pulse raced, panic flooding her body. The figure in front of her stepped closer, the dark shadows swirling around him. The walls seemed to press in on her again. Her mind screamed, but her body couldn't escape. She was being pulled in. And as her vision darkened, she heard the figure's voice, echoing in the distance. It's too late to leave. Her heart hammered in her chest, frantic, desperate. The cold hand that held her wrist tightened, dragging her further into the darkness. She could feel the weight of every movement, every breath, as if the very air had become oppressive, suffocating. She struggled to break free, but the grip was too strong. The woman's face was inches from hers, her hollow eyes boring into hers with an unsettling familiarity. "You can't fight it," the woman whispered, her voice soft and eerily calm. "You're already one of us." Her mind raced. She had to get away. But every inch of her body felt heavy, weighed down by the shadows that seemed to wrap around her like chains. The figure moved closer, his smile widening, twisted and grotesque. The whispering in the room grew louder, more insistent. Thousands of voices now, echoing all around her. "You can't leave. You belong here. You're ours." Her breaths came faster, ragged. Her chest felt tight, like it was being crushed under the weight of 1,000 invisible hands. She looked around, her vision blurring, but all she could see were the faces, dozens of them, haunting and hollow, staring at her from the walls, the corners, the shadows. They were all watching, waiting. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her knees hitting the cold, splintering floor. The woman's hand pulled her up again, lifting her effortlessly. "Don't fight it," the woman said, her voice sweet now, almost kind. "You'll see. Soon you'll understand." Her vision spun, the room shifting and warping like it was alive. Her head was swimming with the voices, with the oppressive presence that seemed to flood her mind, drowning her thoughts. She wanted to scream, but her mouth was dry, her throat constricted with fear. The figure in front of her stepped even closer, his face looming over hers. "Everything ends here," he said softly, almost lovingly. "Your story is over. You're part of this house now." She gasped, struggling to break free again. But it was no use. The shadows were all around her now, twisting, reaching out to claim her. The woman and the figure both stepped back slightly, watching as the darkness seemed to consume the room. The walls closed in on her, the air suffocating, her mind teetering on the brink of madness. "You'll never leave," the figure whispered. "You'll never escape." And then everything went black. The darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her into its endless, consuming depths. She had become a part of it, a part of the house, a part of the shadows. The darkness surrounded her, thick and heavy, pressing against her chest as though it had weight. Her mind felt like it was unraveling, her thoughts slipping through her fingers like sand. She could no longer feel the floor beneath her, nor the cold air against her skin. It was as though she had ceased to exist in the physical world. All that remained was the oppressive silence, the void. But then, a flicker, a distant sound. Her pulse quickened. It was a whisper, soft and barely audible. "Help!" The voice was faint,
Weak.
it sounded familiar. Her mind tried to latch onto it, to make sense of it, but it was fading quickly. Another whisper, "Don't let it take you." She tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, trapped within this endless dark. The voice grew clearer, more desperate. "I was here too," it said. "I couldn't leave." The voice echoed in the darkness, filling her mind with terror. And then the coldness returned. It wasn't the same as before. It was worse. The shadows shifted again, swirling around her, closing in. Her heart pounded, but there was no escape. The walls were tightening, pressing in, and her breath came in panicked gasps. The figure, the woman, they were coming back. Her chest tightened as a realization dawned on her. The darkness had already claimed her. She was already a part of this place, just like the others. Her body wasn't hers anymore. Her mind, her soul, they had been swallowed by the house. And now she would wait. Wait for the next one to stumble through the door, desperate for answers, just like she had. And when they did, the cycle would start again. The whispers would return, and they too would become a part of the house, of the shadows that held it all together. The terror would never end. She was just another lost soul, another echo in the darkness. The weight of the darkness pressed harder, suffocating her as she tried to breathe. But there was no air, no escape. Her mind screamed for freedom, but her body was no longer hers to command. She was a prisoner of the house, a lost soul, trapped in an endless loop, waiting for the next victim to walk through the door. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that echoed in every corner of her mind. "You're not alone," they said. Not anymore. She tried to focus, to remember who she was before all of this, but the memories were slipping away, fading like smoke. Her name, her life, it was becoming distant, unimportant. The shadows moved around her, drawing closer, wrapping tighter, until they were all around her, suffocating her senses. And then, through the fog of her mind, she heard it. A door creaking open. The faintest sound, but enough to make her pulse race. The house was not done. It never would be. Someone had entered. A new presence. The cycle had begun again. But this time she wasn't alone. She could feel their presence, feel their fear, just as she had felt it when she had first entered. Another victim. Another lost soul about to be consumed. Her mind raced. She could feel it now, like a tether, connecting her to the new arrival. The whispers began again, this time louder, more frantic. "Don't listen to them. They're coming for you." She could almost see them, the shadows, the figure, the woman. They were waiting, just as they had waited for her. The cycle was complete, and soon they would have another soul to add to their collection. Another lost wanderer caught in the house's cruel web. She felt herself slipping deeper into the darkness, her existence becoming even more distant. But there was no escape. There would never be an escape. And as the whispers grew louder, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the only one lost in the shadows. The next soul was already here. And it was only a matter of time before they too would become part of the house. Just like her. The presence grew stronger. The footsteps echoed, slow and uncertain, through the corridors of the house. A new soul had entered. She could feel the fear, thick, palpable, radiating from them, just as it had from her when she first stepped inside. The door creaked again, louder this time, as if welcoming the new victim. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices swirling around her, growing more frantic with every passing second. "Don't go further. Turn back. Run before it's too late." But she knew, just as they would soon know, that it was too late. The house had already claimed them. It always did. The figure, the woman, she could feel them now, closer than before, moving in tandem with the new arrival, ready to ensnare them in the same fate that had sealed hers. The darkness pressed against her from all sides. The walls, the floor, the very air itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own, alive with anticipation. It wasn't just the house. It was the shadows, the souls trapped within it, all of them waiting for the next one, the next soul to wander in, the next victim. And as she felt her consciousness slipping further away, the echoes of the whispers grew louder, more desperate. The new arrival was almost at the same place she had been, at the same threshold. The figure's cold laugh echoed through the darkness. "It's never over," the figure's voice rasped, sending chills down her spine. "It's never over for any of us." And then, just as the figure had done to her, she felt the chilling touch of the cold hand on her wrist. Not hers anymore, but the new soul's. They were here. The cycle was beginning again. The shadows stretched, wrapped around them both. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You'll be one of us soon. Don't fight it. And as the new soul was drawn deeper into the house, her fading consciousness could only whisper one last thing.
Run.
Please run. But it was already too late. The darkness that had once suffocated her seemed to fade away, like a distant memory slipping through her fingers. Her mind, fractured and twisted by the house, barely registered the new soul's frantic steps. But she was aware of one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. The figure, the woman, they were closing in again, their presence thick and cold, just as they had been when she was the one stepping into the nightmare. The new arrival was trapped, just as she had been. And now, as the final threads of her existence began to unravel, she felt the weight of time, the weight of every soul lost here, closing in on her. It had been years, decades. How long had she been a part of this place? The walls, the shadows, they seemed to twist and shift with time itself, never truly leaving anyone behind. But now, as she saw the new soul, terrified and unaware of what awaited them, something shifted in her mind. A flicker of something almost forgotten, a piece of humanity. She couldn't let it happen again. The house had taken so much already, swallowed so many lives, and now it was reaching for another. The new soul's cries, soft and desperate, echoed through the darkened halls. But they couldn't hear her. No one could. But she could still feel the pull. The cold hand on their wrist, just as it had once been on hers. The whispering in their ears. The shadows were closing in faster now. She tried to reach out, tried to call out to them, but her voice was drowned in the suffocating silence. And then, just as she thought it was over for them too, a thought passed through her mind. A desperate thought. Was it possible to escape the cycle? Was there a way to break free? Her fading form reached out in vain, grasping for something, anything that could stop the house from claiming yet another soul. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, and with it, the final darkness consumed them both. The cycle had completed. Again. And the house waited, silently, patiently, for the next soul to arrive. The house was silent again. The echoes of the new soul's cries faded into nothingness, swallowed by the thick shadows that lingered in every corner. It was always like this. The darkness would return to its stillness, waiting for the next unsuspecting wanderer to stumble through the door. And then the cycle would begin once more. But for now, there was peace, an eerie, suffocating peace that clung to the walls, pressing in on everything. The whispers had quieted. The figures had receded back into the dark corners from which they came, waiting in patient, eternal hunger. The house had claimed yet another soul. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. She could feel it now, the pull of something ancient, something cold. The remnants of her own consciousness, still lingering in the dark recesses of the house, were beginning to fade. She had been a part of this place for so long, but now she was no longer sure what was left of her. A shadow? A whisper? A memory? Her body, once so full of terror and desperation, had dissolved into the very fabric of the house, absorbed into its unyielding walls. She had tried to escape. She had tried to warn the next soul. But it was all futile. The house was too strong. The shadows were too consuming. And now, as the house waited, as the silence stretched on, she realized something. The only escape was to forget. To let go of everything that had once been. All the pain, the fear, the hope, they were no longer hers to carry. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was simply part of the house. Just like the others. Just like the figure. The woman. The lost souls, forever trapped in the shadows. And as the house breathed, as it waited for the next soul to wander in, she closed her eyes, if there were even eyes to close anymore, and embraced the darkness. It had taken her. And now it would keep her forever. For this house had no end. And neither did the shadows within.